My husband dragged me into court believing I would cry, beg, and hand over the house we'd built together. He sat beside his lawyer with a confident smile because he thought every document was on his side. What he didn't know was that buried deep inside an old file cabinet was one paper he had signed years ago and completely forgotten. The moment that document landed in front of the judge, the smile vanished from his face so quickly that everyone in the courtroom noticed. Before I tell you what happened, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing people from different places sharing these stories, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. What happened inside that courtroom changed both of our lives forever. My name is Tessa Reed. For 12 years, I was married to Grant Mercer. From the outside, our life looked perfect. We owned a beautiful home, attended family gatherings together, and appeared to be the kind of couple people admired. Friends often told us how lucky we were. They had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. The man I married was not the same man sitting across from me in court. Over the years, Grant became cold, controlling, and obsessed with money. Every conversation turned into an argument about finances. Every sacrifice I made for our family was treated as if it had no value. The harder I worked to support our life together, the more he acted as though everything belonged to him. Eventually, I realized the marriage could not be saved. Filing for divorce was one of the hardest decisions I had ever made. I expected it to be painful, but I never imagined how far Grant would go. Instead of seeking a fair settlement, he decided he wanted almost everything. What shocked me most was his determination to take our home. That house meant more to me than any bank account or piece of property. It was where I had spent years building a life. Every room held memories, sacrifices, and moments that mattered to me. Grant knew exactly how important it was, which made his actions feel even more cruel. As the court date approached, he acted like the outcome was already decided. He bragged to people that he would win. He treated me as if I had already lost. While fear followed me every day, I refused to give up. Deep down, I knew this fight wasn't just about a house. It was about standing up for myself after years of being pushed aside. When I first met Grant Mercer, he was the kind of man people naturally liked. He was charming, hardworking, and full of big dreams. Back then, I felt lucky to be with someone who seemed so determined to build a good future. He wasn't wealthy, and neither was I. We were just two people trying to create a life together from the ground up. During the first few years of our marriage, things felt simple. We bought a modest home that needed plenty of work, but we were excited about it. On weekends, we painted walls, repaired old fixtures, and talked about what our future would look like. We spent evenings sitting at our small kitchen table, making plans and laughing about the challenges we faced. Even when money was tight, we felt like a team. Grant often told me that none of his success would be possible without my support. I believed him. I worked long hours, managed household responsibilities, and stood beside him through every obstacle. Whenever he faced setbacks at work, I encouraged him. Whenever he doubted himself, I reminded him of his abilities. We weren't perfect, but we were partners. Then things started to change. At first, the changes were small enough to ignore. Grant's career began taking off, and his income increased significantly. I was proud of him. After years of hard work, he was finally achieving the success he had always wanted. But as his bank account grew, so did his ego. The man who once thanked me for my support slowly became someone who acted as though he had achieved everything alone. He started talking differently. Conversations that once felt warm became cold and critical. He questioned every expense, even routine purchases. If I bought something for the house, he wanted receipts and explanations. If I spent money on myself, he acted as though I was being irresponsible. At first, I told myself he was simply stressed. Success brought new pressures and responsibilities. I kept making excuses for him because I didn't want to believe he was changing. But the criticism became constant. No matter what I did, it wasn't enough. If dinner wasn't perfect, he complained. If the house wasn't spotless, he found fault. If I expressed an opinion he disagreed with, he dismissed it immediately. The support and appreciation that once existed in our marriage slowly disappeared. What hurt most wasn't the arguments. It was the way he began treating my contributions as if they had no value. The years I spent supporting him, encouraging him, and helping build our life together seemed meaningless in his eyes. He acted as though only the money he earned mattered. Over time, I realized Grant viewed almost everything as a transaction. He measured worth in dollars and cents. Even our marriage began to feel like a business arrangement rather than a relationship built on love. There were many nights when I sat alone wondering what had happened to the man I married. Yet I stayed. Part of me kept hoping the person I once loved was still there somewhere beneath the arrogance and bitterness. I convinced myself that if I was patient enough, supportive enough, and understanding enough, the man I fell in love with would come back. I didn't realize then that I was holding on to memories while the reality of my marriage was slowly slipping away. By the time I finally decided to ask for a divorce, I had spent years trying to save a marriage that no longer existed. The decision wasn't made overnight. It came after countless sleepless nights, painful arguments, and the realization that the man I once loved had become someone I barely recognized. I expected Grant to be angry when I told him. I expected disappointment, frustration, and maybe even sadness. What I didn't expect was the level of cruelty that followed. The moment he realized I was serious about leaving, it felt as though a switch flipped inside him. Any respect he once had for me disappeared completely. Instead of trying to reach a fair agreement, he immediately hired an aggressive attorney and turned the divorce into a war. Every week seemed to bring a new legal document. Every filing contained another demand, another accusation, or another attempt to pressure me into giving up. It wasn't enough for Grant to move on with his life. He wanted to win. And more than anything else, he wanted the house. To most people, it was simply a piece of property. To me, it was my entire adult life. It was the place where I celebrated birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries. It was where I sat beside my mother during the final months of her life, caring for her when she needed me most. Every room held memories that could never be replaced. I had spent years improving that house with my own hands. I painted walls, planted gardens, repaired old spaces, and slowly turned it into a home. It represented everything I had worked for. Grant knew all of that. That's what made his actions hurt even more. He understood exactly how much the house meant to me, and he used that knowledge as a weapon. Every demand felt personal. Every legal move seemed designed to cause as much pain as possible. As the divorce dragged on, the damage spread beyond the courtroom. Friends who had known us for years began choosing sides. Some stopped returning my calls altogether. Others believed the version of events Grant shared with them. People I trusted suddenly became distant. The loneliness was overwhelming. There were days when I felt completely isolated, as if my entire life was being pulled apart piece by piece. The man I had spent 12 years supporting was now treating me like an enemy. Still, despite the fear and uncertainty, I refused to surrender. Grant believed he could wear me down until I walked away with nothing. What he didn't realize was that every attack only strengthened my determination to fight for the life I had spent years building. Years before the divorce, there was a time when Grant's confidence looked very different. Back then, he wasn't acting like a man who controlled everything. He was terrified of losing it all. His business had fallen into a serious financial crisis almost overnight. One bad investment led to another, clients disappeared, and unpaid bills began piling up faster than anyone expected. Every day seemed to bring a new problem. Collection notices arrived in the mail. Creditors called constantly. Some days the phone rang so often that neither of us wanted to answer it. For the first time since I had known him, Grant looked genuinely scared. The stress consumed our lives. We spent evenings at the kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, trying to figure out how to stop everything from collapsing. Bankruptcy seemed like a real possibility. There were moments when we honestly believed we could lose our savings, our home, and everything we had spent years building together. During that difficult period, I stood beside him without hesitation. While Grant focused on keeping the business alive, I handled much of the paperwork and communication. I attended meetings, organized records, and helped coordinate appointments with financial advisors and attorneys. I wasn't just supporting him emotionally, I was actively helping him fight for his future. Eventually, lawyers became involved to protect as many assets as possible. They prepared stacks of documents designed to shield certain property from potential claims if the worst happened. Meeting after meeting filled our schedule. New forms seemed to appear every week. At the time, Grant trusted me completely. Whenever another set of documents appeared, he signed them without much concern. His focus was on surviving the crisis. He rarely stopped to read every page carefully. He assumed the attorneys knew what they were doing and trusted that I was helping protect both of us. I remember watching him sign folder after folder while worrying about entirely different things. We were both exhausted, overwhelmed, and desperate to get through the nightmare. Then, slowly, things improved. The business recovered. New opportunities appeared. Debt was paid down. The phone stopped ringing with demands from creditors. Within a few years, the financial crisis became little more than an unpleasant memory. Life moved forward. Neither of us talked about those legal documents anymore. They were packed away with old records and forgotten. As Grant's success returned, so did his confidence. Eventually, even I stopped thinking about that difficult chapter of our lives. By the time the divorce began, those papers were the last thing on my mind. At least they were until one unexpected afternoon, while searching through years of records for my case, I opened an old storage box and found something that immediately made my heart stop. Buried beneath dusty files was a document neither of us had thought about in years. A few weeks before the trial, my attorney asked me to gather every financial record, legal paper, and property document I could find. We wanted to be fully prepared for whatever Grant's legal team might bring into court. At the time, I thought it was just another tedious part of the divorce process. One Saturday afternoon, I climbed into the attic and started sorting through years of old boxes. Most of them contained things I hadn't looked at in ages: tax records, utility bills, insurance paperwork, and family documents that had been forgotten long ago. Hours passed as I worked through dusty folders and storage containers. Just as I was about to quit for the day, I noticed an old metal file cabinet pushed against the back wall. It had been sitting there untouched for years. The drawers were stiff from lack of use, and a thin layer of dust covered the handles. I opened one drawer after another, finding nothing particularly important. Then I came across a storage box packed with legal documents from the financial crisis we had faced years earlier. At first, I almost ignored it. Most of those papers had been prepared by attorneys during the period when Grant's business was struggling. I assumed they were outdated and irrelevant. Still, I decided to look through them one last time before putting them away. Halfway through the stack, one document caught my attention. The title alone made me pause. I sat down and began reading carefully. Then, I read it again. And then a third time. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. The document was a property transfer agreement signed during the financial crisis. The signatures were clear. The dates were official. Every page appeared properly executed and witnessed. According to the agreement, Grant had transferred significant ownership rights of our home directly to me. For several minutes, I simply stared at the paper. It felt impossible. While Grant had spent months building a legal case around taking the house, this document suggested he had already given away rights he was now claiming belonged entirely to him. The more I reviewed it, the more unbelievable it became. If the agreement was valid, Grant's entire strategy could be based on a mistake he didn't even realize existed. I carefully placed the document into a folder and scheduled a meeting with my attorney the very next morning. When she finished reading it, her expression changed immediately. She looked up at me and asked where I had found it. After reviewing every page again, she leaned back in her chair and smiled for the first time in weeks. "This," she said quietly, tapping the document, "could change everything." For the first time since the divorce began, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time: hope. As the trial date drew closer, Grant's confidence seemed to grow with every passing week. He acted less like someone preparing for a legal battle and more like someone celebrating a victory that had already happened. Word traveled quickly through our shared circle of friends and acquaintances. People began telling me things they had heard from him. According to Grant, the house was already his. He claimed the court would have no choice but to rule in his favor. Some people even repeated his prediction that I would eventually give up before the trial ever began. At first, hearing those stories hurt. After everything we had been through together, it was painful knowing he was speaking about me that way. But as time passed, I noticed something else. The more confident Grant became, the less careful he seemed. His attorney filed motion after motion, each one creating additional pressure. Some requests were clearly designed to drain my finances and make the process as difficult as possible. Every new document felt like another attempt to wear me down. Grant seemed to enjoy it. Whenever we crossed paths during hearings, he carried himself with the same smug confidence. He barely looked at me anymore. When he did, his expression suggested he believed the outcome was already decided. To him, I looked defeated. What he didn't know was that everything had changed the day I found that forgotten document. After reviewing it, my attorney gave me one very important piece of advice. Tell no one. Not my friends. Not my family. Not anyone connected to the case. Most importantly, Grant could not know. The strategy was simple. We would allow him to continue believing exactly what he already believed. Every boast he made, every arrogant prediction, and every legal maneuver pushed him further toward a surprise he would never see coming. Keeping quiet wasn't easy. There were countless moments when I wanted to confront him. I wanted to ask whether he remembered signing those papers years ago. I wanted to watch his confidence disappear right then and there, but I stayed silent. Meanwhile, Grant interpreted my silence completely wrong. He thought I was scared. He thought the pressure was working. He thought every hearing brought him one step closer to taking the home that meant so much to me. In reality, I was no longer focused on his threats. I was focused on the courtroom. I knew there would come a moment when that document would finally be placed in front of a judge. A moment when Grant would realize that the case he had spent months building rested on a foundation that could crumble in seconds. So while he celebrated a victory he hadn't earned, I quietly prepared for the day everything changed. And with every passing week, that day moved closer. The morning of the trial arrived faster than I expected. After months of stress, arguments, and legal battles, everything would finally come down to what happened inside that courtroom. When I entered the building, my stomach was full of nerves. I had barely slept the night before. Yet as I walked toward the courtroom, I reminded myself that I had done everything I could to prepare. Grant arrived a few minutes later. The confidence on his face was impossible to miss. He walked through the doors wearing an expensive suit and carrying himself like a man who had already won. He laughed with his attorney, shook hands with people in the hallway, and never once looked worried. If anything, he seemed excited. When the hearing began, his attitude didn't change. His lawyers stood and presented argument after argument explaining why Grant deserved ownership of the house. They spoke about finances, property records, and their interpretation of the law. Every point was delivered with confidence. The judge listened carefully and took notes while reviewing the evidence. I remained quiet beside my attorney. Several times throughout the morning, I noticed Grant glancing in my direction. Each time, he wore the same smug expression. It was the look of someone expecting surrender. I could almost tell what he was thinking. He believed I was overwhelmed. He believed the pressure had finally broken me. Hours passed. Witnesses spoke. Documents were reviewed. Legal arguments continued. From the outside, everything appeared to be unfolding exactly the way Grant had predicted for months. His confidence seemed to grow with every passing minute. Even some people sitting in the gallery looked convinced that the outcome was already becoming clear. But I knew something they didn't. Hidden inside my attorney's case file was the document that could change everything. Still, we waited. My attorney remained calm and patient, allowing Grant's side to finish presenting their case. The longer they spoke, the more certain Grant became that victory was within reach. Then, finally, the moment arrived. As a discussion about the property's ownership rights came to an end, my attorney slowly stood from her chair. The courtroom fell quiet. She addressed the judge respectfully and requested permission to submit one additional document into evidence. At first, it seemed like a routine request. But as she reached into her file and removed the paper we had kept secret for weeks, I saw something change. For the first time all day, Grant's confident smile began to fade. The moment my attorney handed the document to the judge, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed completely. Only seconds earlier, Grant had been sitting comfortably in his chair, convinced the case was going his way. Now the room had fallen into a silence so deep that even the sound of papers being turned seemed unusually loud. The judge began reviewing the document carefully. Page by page, he examined every detail. I watched Grant's expression closely. At first, he looked confused. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. His lawyer reached for the document packet and started reading through it. Then, everything changed. The confidence that had carried Grant through the entire day seemed to disappear almost instantly. His attorney flipped through the pages again, this time much faster. He checked dates, signatures, and attached records. Then he started searching through his own files as if hoping to find something that would explain what he was seeing. There was nothing. The document was real. The signatures were authentic. The dates matched official records. The witness information was properly documented. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Years earlier, during the financial crisis that nearly destroyed Grant's business, he had legally signed a property transfer agreement that gave me significant ownership rights to the house, the very property he was now trying to claim entirely for himself. For months, Grant had built his entire case around the belief that those rights belonged to him. He had filed motions, made demands, and spent thousands on legal fees pursuing an outcome that suddenly seemed impossible. The agreement directly contradicted the foundation of everything he had argued. As the judge continued reviewing the evidence, Grant became visibly uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, his hands tightened together. The smug smile that had been on his face all day was gone. For the first time since the divorce began, he looked uncertain, then he looked worried, and finally, he looked genuinely afraid. I could see the realization spreading across his face. He remembered signing stacks of papers during the financial crisis. At the time, he had trusted the attorneys and barely paid attention to what was placed in front of him. Now that forgotten decision had returned, the document he never thought about again was sitting in front of a judge, and it was destroying the case he had spent months building. For the first time that day, Grant wasn't acting like the winner. He was acting like a man who suddenly understood he might lose everything he came to court to take from me. Once the judge finished reviewing the property transfer agreement, his attention turned directly to Grant. The courtroom remained silent as he began asking questions about the document. At first, Grant tried to remain calm. He claimed he couldn't remember the details of the agreement because it had been signed years earlier during the financial crisis. He suggested it might have been part of a larger group of documents he never fully reviewed. But the questions kept coming. The judge asked about the signatures. Grant admitted they were his. The judge asked about the dates. Grant acknowledged they were accurate. The judge asked whether he had ever challenged the validity of the agreement before the divorce proceedings began. Again, the answer was no. With every response, the situation became more difficult for him. Soon his explanations started changing. One moment he claimed he didn't remember signing the document. The next moment he argued he hadn't understood its importance. Then he suggested it should no longer matter because so much time had passed. The inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. I could see his attorney becoming increasingly uncomfortable beside him. The confidence that had filled their side of the courtroom earlier was gone. As the discussion continued, additional records were reviewed. Those records revealed something even more damaging. The property transfer agreement had not simply been forgotten. Information related to it had never been properly disclosed during parts of the legal process leading up to the trial. That discovery immediately caught the judge's attention. What had started as a disagreement over ownership suddenly became a question of whether important information had been intentionally left out. Grant tried to explain himself, but every attempt seemed to make things worse. Finally, after reviewing all the evidence, the judge reached his conclusion. The agreement was valid. It was legally binding. And it directly affected the ownership rights Grant had been trying to claim. His attempt to take the house failed completely. The judge then addressed Grant's conduct during the case. His words were measured but unmistakably critical. He expressed concern about the missing information and the way the matter had been handled. The courtroom was completely still. Just hours earlier, Grant had entered the building acting like a man preparing to celebrate. He had expected applause, victory, and control. Instead, everyone present watched as the case unraveled around him. The outcome he had spent months predicting vanished in a single afternoon. His confidence disappeared. His arguments collapsed. And the house he believed he was taking from me remained beyond his reach. For the first time since the divorce began, Grant looked like a man forced to face the consequences of his own actions. Months passed after the trial, and life slowly began to settle into something I hadn't felt in years: peace. The courtroom loss followed Grant long after the judge made his decision. The image he had worked so hard to build suffered serious damage. People who once admired his confidence began seeing a different side of him. His credibility took a hit, and the consequences of the case affected both his finances and his reputation. For years, Grant had believed success could solve every problem. He thought money gave him control over people and situations, but the courtroom taught him something he never expected. Some mistakes cannot be fixed simply by writing a check. As for me, I stayed in the house he had fought so hard to take away. For the first time in a long time, the home felt truly mine. I started making small changes at first. I repainted rooms that had remained untouched for years. I replaced old furniture and redesigned spaces that reminded me of painful memories. With every project, the house felt less like a place connected to my past and more like a place built for my future. The most important change wasn't inside the house, though. It was inside me. I stopped surrounding myself with people who only appeared when things were easy. Instead, I spent time with friends who had supported me during the hardest moments of my life. Their loyalty reminded me that genuine relationships are worth far more than appearances. Then one day, months after the trial, Grant contacted me. His message was polite, almost cautious. He said he wanted to talk. He claimed he had spent time reflecting on everything that happened. He admitted that his greed had cost him more than he ever imagined. He spoke about regret and hoped we could repair some kind of relationship. I read the message once and then put my phone down. There was nothing left to discuss. Some damage cannot be undone simply because someone finally understands the consequences of their actions. I never replied. When I think back to everything that happened, one memory stands above all the others. I remember the exact moment that forgotten document was placed in front of the judge. I remember the confidence draining from Grant's face as he realized everything was about to change. For years I had carried the weight of fear, disappointment, and self-doubt. That day, I finally set it down. And for the first time in years, I felt completely free.